75% of New York City landlords have had to cancel or delay making major repairs like replacing roofs and boilers because they can't afford it. And that's because of the 2019 rent stabilization law, which doesn't allow them to raise rents in order to cover the increased expenses. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Look, I shouldn't have to tell you, but rent control, rent stabilization, whatever BS term they want to use to call it, doesn't work, okay? And this story that I have today is pure proof of that fact. Basically, New York landlords, they can't make repairs, okay? They've had to cancel and delay making major repairs because they can't raise their rents enough to cover the extremely high costs that are necessary in order to, replace things, okay? So when you have a multi-million-dollar building, it is not cheap to replace something like the boiler or like the roof on it, right? Anybody could tell you this. It's not cheap to replace a furnace in a house. It's not cheap to replace a roof on a single-family house either. I've replaced some of mine and it cost 10 grand for one house, okay? So now imagine doing that for a large multi-family building where a lot of people live, and you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, right? Well, how are you supposed to cover that cost when you can't raise your rents? Okay, you can't cover that cost. Basically, you're stuck in a bad position where you have a whole bunch of people you can't raise the rent on, they're paying under market rates, and then this major thing is necessary, in order to keep your building functioning, and you can't afford it. And it was all created by this 2019 rent stabilization law. So it's really hurt landlords a lot, okay? So I don't believe in any sort of rent control, but this latest law up in New York, this goes to show you, the law of unintended consequences, right? They didn't intend on this sort of thing to happen where all of a sudden there's all this deferred maintenance. All of a sudden there's all these capital expenditures that aren't being taken care of, and you have buildings that are slowly falling apart. They're falling apart. That's the truth. And you're only going to see more of this as time goes by. 2019 was only 4 years ago at this point. So as time goes forward, you're going to see more and more buildings with tons of deferred maintenance, safety issues, etc., where the landlords, they can't afford to fix them up. They already talk about they have units inside these buildings where they've basically just set them aside, say we're not even renting them out because it's not worth it to fix them. That's bad when you've got that kind of situation going on. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Are you surprised that, maintenance was deferred by landlords who can't raise their rent to cover the costs? Are you surprised by that? This is basic economics. This is basic stuff that they taught about rent control a long time ago. And all of these politicians, all of these bureaucrats, all these progressive left-leaning morons didn't bother reading what could possibly happen. And now these stats are coming out. And slowly over time, it's only going to get worse. So, I'm not surprised. I know some of the people who watch my videos are angry tenants who don't like landlords. So maybe after you read this story, you'll be a little bit shocked by it. So let's get into the article. This article is coming from the New York Post, and it says, "The data proves it. New York progs should spare the little guy their housing help." Yeah, and interesting article. So let's go. Somehow, progressive help for the little guy always winds up hurting him. The latest, a survey from the Community Housing Improvement Program. It shows that 75% of responding landlords who manage rent-stabilized housing units in the city, there are around 1 million, have been forced to delay critical repairs, including on boilers and roofs. Why? Because Dems in Albany left landlords no choice after passing the ill-named Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. The 2019 law hamstrung owners who need to raise rent in order to cover repair and improvement costs, and the earthquake it caused continues to ripple. 55% say they're backing off security upgrades, a necessity in our crime-ridden city. 41% have stopped switching to LED lights, a pet project of the same Dems who backed the law, and 26% are foregoing tech improvements to fuel efficiency in heat and hot water. So yeah, landlords are cutting back wherever they can. Okay, be that in the fuel efficiency upgrades. That stuff is expensive. Okay, we're talking about they're whining about climate change and how all this stuff is going to happen. All those retrofitting of the building is extremely expensive. Yet they tell landlords, well, we want you to spend millions upon millions of dollars over here, but we're not going to give you any opportunity to raise the rent to cover that cost. Well, a landlord's not going to do that, okay? A landlord is not going to purposefully spend millions of dollars and then never be able to recover the money that they invested. That's dumb. We would rather not, okay? The other thing they were talking about here is foregoing, security improvements, right? Now, this is bad for the tenants, obviously. So when you start talking about things like the landlords deferring maintenance, holding back on capital expenditures, not upgrading the units, and holding back on security investments, etc. Right now, these units are still livable. They're just very old, very dated. You might have a lot of stuff breaking down from time to time. It's still compliant because they keep it working, right? But you might be living in an apartment where it's extremely drafty inside. Why? Because, there's poor insulation, very inefficient heating system, bad windows. Who knows, right? But what is the motivation for the landlord to ever replace those old crappy items? There's none. There's absolutely none because it will cost them a ton of money and they will never be able to get a return on that investment. So they're just like, we're just going to patch it together. We're going to put some duct tape on this, keep the window sealed. We'll put a little sheet of plastic on over the glass after, it cracks and, that'll be just fine, right? Well, you know what? That it's bad for the tenants. They sitting here and they're like, oh yeah, well, I want to keep my rent cheap. And like, well, you know what? If you want these nice things, right? And that's the problem. You can't have these nice things without there being some cost involved. It's just like if you're buying a car, right? If you want all of the latest, I want keyless entry. I want a full electric car, like a Tesla. I want the full computer system in it, right? Well, those electric cars are $100,000, a lot of them, right? So you have to pay if you want all of those features inside your vehicle. Now, if you can't afford those features, what do you get? Well, I've got my 2003 Toyota Corolla, right? And it runs, but it's old, it's ugly, it's got rust coming up on it. The seats are ripped and torn it has a slight odor on the inside. Well, it's the same with apartments, okay? You're going to have your old, crappy, falling apart place, and that's what you're going to be stuck with because guess what? You artificially kept those rents low. You said you didn't want to pay those higher rents. And now the government is forcing the landlords basically to give you a lower product, and you're stuck with it. So deal with it. So renters in these units pay low rent but suffer consequences. As necessary but unaffordable repairs get postponed. Worse, an estimated 35,000 apartments stand vacant because repairs needed to rent them out now lie beyond the financial grasp of the landlord, further constricting housing supply and driving up prices, again hurting those who can least afford it. And the ugly trend has only been supercharged by runaway inflation. 80% of CHIP's members report that operating costs have skyrocketed more than 15% since 2019, far above the legally allowable rent hikes. Right? Yeah, so that's the other thing, right? They say since 2019, since this law is passed, inflation for the landlords, and this is them saying it themselves, right? This isn't what the government says our inflation is. That's garbage. That's complete garbage, okay? But landlords are saying, hey, our expenses on average have increased by 15%. Now, the government is only allowing them a rent hike that is much lower than that. I believe it's less than half of that since 2019, right? So they can't even cover the cost of their increasing expenses. So some of them are forced to leave their units vacant. Now imagine, okay, you own, let's say, a building that has 100 units in it. So two of the units, maybe the tenant has finally moved out, right? But you're stuck at a rent stabilized rate, which is 25% of the actual going market rate right now. So if you fix this unit up, if you spend, like if you had a tenant in there for a long amount of time, it might cost you 20 grand, 30 grand to really, bring that unit back up to date, right? So how are you going to recover that money if the new tenant is only paying 25% of the going market rate? You're not. Okay, and so some landlords, they say, well, I'll take this as an acceptable part of my vacancy loss. Okay, and I understand why they are doing that. It's not a good thing, no, but their hands are tied, and they're hoping that eventually some smart minds will come up into the state government and modify this law to make it actually workable for small landlords and big landlords alike, right? Now, my personal belief is it's not going to happen. These laws are only going to get more strict as time goes by. And eventually, the housing stock will fall into disrepair. A lot of these affordable housing units will just disappear. And that is, it's just not a good scenario overall. So, yeah, I'm glad that they finally have some stats and some proof showing that, hey, guess what? This rent control law doesn't work. Okay, these rent stabilization, as they call it, it's nothing but a different name for the same old thing, which is rent control, and it does not work.